Buenos días, mi nombre es Jorge Carrera y estoy acompañado por Pablo Carreras Mayer. Ambos somos miembros del directorio del Banco Central de la República Argentina y estamos continuando con este panel sobre estabilidad macrofinanciera y desarrollo económico. En este momento es un gran placer y un honor tener como invitado en esta presentación al profesor Jeffrey Sachs. El profesor Sachs es profesor universitario y director del Centro para el Desarrollo Sostenible en la Universidad de Columbia, donde dirigió el Instituto de la Tierra desde 2002 hasta 2016, y presidente de la Red de Soluciones de Desarrollo Sostenible de las Naciones Unidas. Fue profesor por más de 20 años en la Universidad de Harvard, Estados Unidos, donde obtuvo su licenciatura, maestría y un doctorado en Economía. Sachs ha recibido 40 doctorados honorarios y sus premios recientes incluyen el premio Tang en Desarrollo Sostenible en 2022. Su más reciente libro es The Age of Globalization, Geography, Technology and Institution, publicado en el 2020. Su presentación en el día de hoy es el rol de la diplomacia en el desarrollo económico. Dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful invitation to be at the Monetary and Banking Conference, and also to greet you and so many friends in Argentina. Well, we are in an enormously difficult environment right now, macroeconomically, and that is true almost everywhere in the world. The crisis is severe and likely to get worse in the short term. The reason is we are battling a number of major disruptions, almost all of them human-caused rather than natural, but nonetheless very difficult and deep disruptions that are continuing to afflict the world economy. And because of the lack of diplomacy, as you mentioned, a theme of my talk, we don't have cooperation to solve these deep problems right now at the global scene. I would say to my friends in Argentina, because Argentina is an important member of the G20, which will meet in November, that is an occasion for Argentina and for other countries to insist that the big powers, the United States, China, Russia, and others, work together to overcome the current crises, because all the rest of the world right now is being profoundly endangered and disrupted by the conflicts among the major countries. We face multiple shocks. This is quite obvious. We face the continuing shocks of the COVID pandemic, which disrupted the entire world economy, deepened the crisis, especially in developing countries, and disrupted global supply chains in a way that continues until today. We know that recovery from the pandemic was incomplete, and especially that the developing countries were lagging behind because the wealthier countries used strong fiscal and monetary stimulus to bounce back from the sharp decline of 2020. But of course, developing countries could not do that. Argentina has no fiscal space at all, obviously, but Argentina is not alone in that. All through the world, other than in Europe, the United States, and a few other countries, the recovery from COVID was actually almost non-existent, not just incomplete. Then came the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has been a profoundly disruptive factor, and a very dangerous one militarily, as well as profoundly disruptive economically. Of course, a lot of people are being killed in Ukraine on both sides, but even more ominously, the war continues to escalate, and there is even talk by many countries of the risks of nuclear war as a result of this conflict. And this is extraordinarily dangerous. We have not heard talk like this for 60 years, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has its 60th anniversary this very month, because the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in October 1962. When the war broke out in February 24th, the Western countries imposed very heavy sanctions on Russia, with the attempt to use economic means to stop Russia's war abilities. Predictably, this failed because Russia was able to reorient a significant amount of its trade in oil to Asia, away from Europe. But what is quite striking is that the sanctions had a major adverse effect on Europe, a boomerang effect, which put Europe into a recession which is becoming extremely deep. As the war escalated, Russia cut off the flows of gas to Western Europe. And this deepened the crisis in Europe, because Europe could not conceivably replace the gas by other international means. Oil, yes, but not gas, because gas comes in pipelines, gas requires heavy infrastructure, and gas cannot simply be reoriented. And so the result was a major supply shock to Europe, first and foremost, but also, of course, to developing countries around the world that suffered a significant increase of food prices, fertilizer prices, and oil and gas prices. So now Europe in a very deep recession, and the United States are probably in recession as well. Now, those supply shocks, which were very serious, both from COVID, the war, and the sanctions, meant that we entered a period of stagflation. This is the first worldwide stagflation in 40 years. It brings back a lot of memories for me, because I began my economics career 42 years ago as an assistant professor at Harvard. My dissertation in 1980 was on the supply shocks of the 1970s, and my first published book in 1982 was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. We have a similar constellation of events now as we did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And one can recall in Argentina, those were not easy years in Argentina in the early 1980s economically. Of course, they were years of hyperinflation, in fact. Now, the reason why the stagflation is so powerful right now is twofold. On the one side, the supply shocks are very strong. On the other side, the monetary stimulus that the Federal Reserve applied after March 2020 was the strongest in our history. The Central Bank of Argentina could only dream of getting away with a monetary expansion like the one the Fed used. The Fed essentially printed $3 trillion of base money. $3 trillion. If Argentina did 1,000th of that, it gets into trouble. But the Fed produced, through massive open market operations that were buying the bonds sold by the Treasury to fund unprecedented budget deficits, increased base money spectacularly. And it was very interesting from a monetary theory point of view. The first effects were only in the asset markets. So the first effects of this huge monetary expansion were a booming stock market. The rich got richer than ever before. Also, other commodities boomed. One evidence of the remarkable monetary expansion was the boom of cryptocurrencies, which in my view have zero fundamental value and zero social value as well, I might add. But Bitcoin soared to $60,000 a Bitcoin because the Fed's expansion was so extraordinary. Non-fungible tokens, NFTs, soared in value. Art soared in value, even as the contraction from the COVID pandemic was taking hold. But then, after about a year, the price increases went from the asset markets into the commodity markets. So we started to see increases of wheat prices, of other grain prices, of copper prices, of oil prices. And you could watch the monetary mechanism working its way through the system. First assets, then commodities, and by now into the core economy itself. That is wages and prices of non-commodity goods and services. So the inflation in the United States, nothing that Argentina would even notice, it's up to maybe around 8%. So you might say, my God, that's price stability. But in fact, from a US point of view, it's pretty unusually high. Europe has topped 10% in the Eurozone. And the result of the supply shocks on the one side, which have pushed up commodities and prices, especially of energy and food, and the monetary expansion on the other side, means a full-blown stagflation, as I mentioned, of the first time in the last 40 years. The Fed, to defend its position, now is raising interest rates significantly. The US economy is perhaps already in recession. As you know, we've had, on preliminary data, 2 negative quarters. So one could say a technical recession if the preliminary data hold up. The economy seems stronger than that for the moment, but the Fed is continuing to ratchet up interest rates, and the disruptions from the war and from the sanctions regime continue to operate. So I predict an outright US recession that goes along with the outright European recession. Now, it happens that China also is experiencing a sharp slowdown, maybe even stronger words might apply. And this also needs to be looked at from many points of view. The United States is in an economic war with China. Have no doubt about it. And it's an awful mistake, in my opinion. But US policymakers are trying actively to harm the Chinese economy. I don't make the accusation lightly. I make it after a cascade of multiple deliberate injuries to the Chinese economy, starting with unilateral trade measures, then unilateral measures on financial flows, on foreign direct investment, both from China into the US market and from the US to the Chinese market. And most recently, in restrictions on exports of US high technology, especially high-end semiconductors, to China. We also tried very hard to break major Chinese enterprises like Huawei and ZTE. This is part of a geopolitical game, but an extremely dangerous game. It is a US version of containment applied to China in the same way that the US once applied it to the Soviet Union. The Chinese don't like it very much, by the way. They don't like the #1 economy in the world saying quite explicitly, we are out to harm the #2 economy in the world. But that is absolutely what's happening. Now, that's also destroying supply chains undermining confidence, and ratcheting up geopolitical tensions, especially across the Straits of Taiwan. So the US has a two-front war, economic war, one with Russia, one with China, and the disruptions of this war are worldwide. China's economy is definitely hurting from this, and because China's the main trade partner of much of the world, that percolates throughout the entire world. So if you added up the COVID shocks, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions regime, the geopolitical tensions, the tightening of credit by the Fed and the European Central Bank as a delayed response to the massive increase of liquidity in 2020, you have quite a brew. But it's not even limited to that, because there's one more major shock that is hitting the world, and that is the climate shocks that are being felt almost everywhere. And in 2022, almost in an uncanny way, major climate shocks being felt in all of the major regions of the world. The United States just had a massive hurricane, one of the worst landfalling hurricanes in US modern history. The storm continues, but it made two landfalls with massive devastation in Florida and in North and South Carolina. We've had drought across Europe, massive failures of rains in Africa. We've had flooding more recently in Europe, massive drought in China, and heat waves and many other side effects of the climate shocks being felt around the world. Now, when you have such a complex concurrence of events, this is when diplomacy is absolutely vital. Many of those supply shocks, even COVID as it continues till today, especially the war, the geopolitical shocks, the management of the fallout from monetary tightening, which will hit dozens of countries trying to repay their debts, the tightening of global capital markets, all of this requires an active, cooperative approach by the major countries. It requires decisions within the International Monetary Fund to be on the liquidity lender of last resort side, to pay absolutely quick and urgent attention to countries in financial stress. It requires the bilateral creditor countries, China and European countries and the United States and others, to work together for recapitalizing debts coming due. It requires cooperation in the international development banks, especially the multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, which doesn't even have a leader right now, for heaven's sake, and in other venues, to make sure that there is public financing that can offset declines of private financing. In short, we need the G20 right now to acknowledge that this is the worst economic crisis, certainly since the early 1980s, and it could quickly dwarf that crisis because we have a very hot and very dangerous war underway right now, which we did not have in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in the same way. And so when you add it up, I think that this is the worst situation that we've experienced probably since the end of World War II in terms of dangers. We need cooperation to avoid a contagion of financial crises and to address the underlying sources of these crises, an approach to ending the war on a diplomatic basis, which incidentally could happen if the United States would finally recognize that its attempt to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia was a major provocation that led to this extraordinarily dangerous deterioration and the onset of war itself. We need cooperation to continue to push COVID to the end of this pandemic, because we're not done with this pandemic yet. We need the multilateral financial institutions to be acting with alacrity by making larger loans, helping countries to make major structural investments, for example, in green energy, because private capital markets will not make these investments right now. We need provision of liquidity so that countries don't get into debt distress because of contagion, which we know to be absolutely possible in moments like this. And we need to avoid further deterioration of relations between the US and China. It's a large order, and I have to tell you, I'm not very optimistic right now, because I don't see the political will for this, despite the fact that all of the major regions are suffering economically. There's no one that is getting through this crisis well. Not the United States, not Europe, not China, certainly not Russia, nor the developing countries. There's no bright spot that says, oh, well, here's the silver lining. There's only a worldwide crisis that is at risk of getting out of control. So that's the backdrop, and this requires absolutely skilled macroeconomic management for Argentina and countries like Argentina, which actually do not have terrible fundamentals, but don't have any trust in the international capital markets. We need liquidity. We need routine recapitalization of debt. Argentina's trouble, incidentally, is its reputation, not its reality. If you looked at the fiscal balance sheets of the government of Argentina and the federal government of the United States, you'd rather have Argentina's balance sheet. It's got lower debts, it's got smaller deficits, but the fact of the matter is nobody trusts Argentina. And so even when it comes to very, very small amounts of refinancing, it's a crisis. That's what the international system needs to address. That is a market failure, by the way. That is a profound market failure. That's not normal. That is a market failure because our institutions do not address this kind of financial panic or self-fulfilling financial crisis, where a country has a bad reputation, therefore it can't borrow, therefore it has a bad reputation because it can't routinely refinance its debts. If you took away the name Argentina from Argentina's instruments and just showed the balance sheets, the fisc, and all the rest, it would be a pretty big yawn. No one would be too concerned. But since everybody always expects the worst, they often get the worst. And that's the problem that we need to overcome also, self-fulfilling crises. So this is a big mess of a situation. I wish the United States would get back to the business of business and out of the business of war and conflict. The world would be a lot safer. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you, and back over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your wonderful presentation. I will start with the Q&A. I have a first question related to, you talk about the importance of diplomacy and multilateral cooperation in this context. And I was wondering, if we go back some 10 to 12 years ago, during the 2008-2009 international financial crisis, multilateral cooperation and stimulus was at the top of the order of the day. All the countries around the world were trying to cooperate. There was a clear-cut global stimulus, and financial cooperation was essential to address that crisis. Now we fast forward 10, 12 years in the future to the present, and we see that cooperation is almost non-existent. And I was wondering what changed in the middle, what happened during those 10 to 12 years to get to this point. And I'd love to hear your opinion on the matter.
I think we can say pretty surely that the major difference of 2008-9 and now is the geopolitical context. In 2008 and 9, the relations between the US and China were normal. The relations with Russia were not good, but they were also not in direct conflict, even war, as they are right now. And so the geopolitics did not overshadow the response to the crisis. Also, the crisis, it was pretty clear in 2008, had one overwhelming cause: bad policy in the United States. The US Treasury Secretary unbelievably and unaccountably decided one weekend that he would teach Wall Street a lesson by driving Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy. And frankly, he didn't know what he was doing and what was about to come, because by doing so, he unleashed a massive financial panic that began the following Monday. And he didn't even understand the mechanics of bankruptcy in the UK and the implications for interbank finance and the centrality of Lehman Brothers in that web. Well, without going into all the details, there was a disaster, and then there was an attempt to overcome the financial crisis. And President Obama came into office and took a multilateral view, and that worked reasonably well to put a floor to a very deep crisis. Everything changed during the past 14 years. It's very interesting to ask why. You get two completely different narratives of why. If you listen to the mainstream US government story, it's because Russia was an aggressor starting in 2014 and then especially in 2022, and China became an aggressor too, with the major military expansion and threatening countries in the South China Sea. If you take a different perspective, which I find more accurate, it is that the United States played an extraordinarily unhelpful and provocative role, because in my view, the United States got very nervous about China's success starting around 2014 and deliberately started to try a containment policy of China. I remember when that first struck me that that was their real new policy, I thought it was mind-boggling. I thought it was absolutely incredible that the United States thought that it could contain China. And I thought Donald Trump was an absolutely horrible president anyway. So I thought he would do all sorts of unpredictable things. But the truth is that not only did he start this anti-China policy, but Biden has exactly contributed and continued it, even intensified it. It's a deep US state policy. It's not due to a particular politician. It's actually the permanent state which says China's a threat. We must stop it. And when it comes to Russia, I think the balance of accounts is far more complicated than the US allows for, because the US approach has been to expand NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. And I often ask my, well, I don't know if I have friends in the US government anymore, but my colleagues in the US government, I ask them, what would happen if Mexico decided that it would enter a military alliance with China? Would the United States say, yeah, that's not our business, that's whatever Mexico wants to do? Well, we have a kind of hint about that because when Cuba tried that in 1960, we invaded Cuba right away, and then went to Cuban Missile Crisis. We wouldn't like it. But when we say, well, we're going to have a military alliance with Ukraine, and Russia says, don't do that, that's our core security interest, we say, what's the problem? We're peace-loving. Don't get so upset. It's all fine. And we're going to go to Georgia, by the way. So, you know, if you look at your Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, do note that it will be surrounded by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. But don't worry, we love peace. We love you. We don't have anything against you. And so this is the mindset of the United States, in my mind, that is so provocative that I don't know whether they don't want to, can't, or are playing a game and pretend that they don't think about the perspective from the other side. But all of this is to say the big change of context in the last 10 years is geopolitical. We lost the basic cooperative framework. And Biden defines the world crisis as a crisis of democracies versus autocracies. When he said that, I put my head in my hands because he's defining the world crisis as division. Those divisions are not going to go away anytime soon. So what he's basically telling us is we're going to have a divided world for years to come, maybe a dangerously divided world. But nobody talked in those terms 10 years ago or 12 years ago. But those are the normal terms to talk right now. And I really bemoan that fact. I guess partly because I'm an economist, and economists really do like open trade. I believe in open trade. I believe in a world that is interconnected. I believe that China's rise was a good thing, not a bad thing. It's a good thing for China, but good for all the rest of us too. So I don't view it in negative terms. But if you are a military strategist, you view it in zero-sum terms, that their rise must be bad for us. I just can't accept that logic.
Professors, I am a great admirer of your work on climate change and sustainability. So I changed the focus of my question. As you know, key institutions like United Nations, G20, FSB are promoting substantial emission reduction measures involving strong commitments by advanced and also developing countries that start reducing emission at different rates. As you know, most analysts use something like the environmental causeness curve hypothesis and link the level of development and the level of emission. So in some idea for countries like us, developing countries, the idea of catching up to the level of development of advanced economy tends to be difficult if we have the new, or we follow this new condition of immediately start to reduce emissions. It's something like the famous idea of kicking away the ladder. How can advanced economies internalize the historical responsibility for global environmental damage and help those developing countries to take a different, a new development path? How to avoid that developing countries perceive that climate compromise as a change of rule that jeopardize its path to development? And an additional question, this is more structural, but now you present a description of the crisis that was very damaging in the sense of we are going to an stagflation, maybe a global stagflation. So my additional question is how this crisis, macroeconomic crisis, could affect the compromise of fight against climate change.
Yeah, this is a great question. And there's a very basic, crucial idea, I think, which is the following. The good news is that the cost of zero carbon energy, especially wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, has really come down incredibly sharply. But it is very capital intensive technology. So the difference of powering electricity with wind and powering electricity with gas is that with wind, you pay up front. You have to finance the turbines and the transmission system. With gas, you pay along the way. Of course, you buy some turbines, but you pay for the gas along the way. And if you actually ask which is cheaper, to do it through wind and solar or to do it through gas, the answer is it depends. If the interest rate is very low, actually it's cheaper, even cheaper in any discounted sense, to do it through the zero carbon, because you take into account, you don't pay for all that fuel down the road, you only pay for the capital up front. And if the capital cost is essentially a very low interest rate times the cost of capital, what we call the levelized cost or the permanent cost of that energy is tiny. So suppose that Argentina could finance, build out an entire zero carbon grid at 2% interest rates, 50 years. You'd say, hell, that's great. Let's do it, because 2% on some billions would be a very low cost, and you don't pay for anything afterwards, just a little bit of operations and maintenance. The problem comes with high interest rates. If you try to finance a renewable energy system with high interest rates, you get crushed, because the capital costs are very large relative to a fossil fuel energy system. And with high interest rates, it's much more expensive, even on a levelized basis. So the real answer to the question, in my view, is long-term finance. Long-term finance that doesn't exist right now. To say to developing countries, build out your renewables, but go to the Eurobond market and pay 13% interest rates for it is insane. It's impossible. You could never make the energy transformation that way. So what we need is guaranteed, committed, long-term, by that I mean 40 years or longer, low interest rates to finance the energy transformation in the developing countries. Then it would be cheaper to do, actually. Cheaper in an absolute sense, also would save the climate. The rich countries don't do anything right now. They're just absolutely almost useless because they don't understand this basic issue. And they're uninterested in the situation of the developing countries, except to tell them, you do it, but we don't have to pay for it. And they promised 100 billion of financing, which is far too small. And then they couldn't even come up with that, even when they were allowed to do the accounting. If you're allowed to write your own report card and you still get D's, that's pretty pathetic. If you're allowed to write your own report card, at least you should get B's and A's. But the rich countries, they define what they mean by climate finance, and then they can't even come up with a meager 100 billion a year, which in a $100 trillion world economy just is not much of a lift. So my strong recommendation is very serious development financing that taps the capital markets for the long term. I would like to see the Inter-American Development Bank and the Latin American Development Fund, the CAF, increase their funding for green energy by a factor 10 and go into the capital markets to do it and on lend at low interest rates. Don't push the government of Argentina to do it, because Argentina can't borrow anything right now, much less to finance capital intensive energy transformation. So that's my basic answer. The same situation's true in Africa. The African Development Bank, to cover a continent that doesn't even have electricity, much less green electricity, has a total lending flow for 1.4 billion people of $12 billion a year. In other words, nothing. And this is taken as kind of normal by the rich world. Now, there's another issue that's quite important in this, and that is not this energy transformation, which I think can be debt financed as long as the debt is 40 years plus and at low interest rates. But the question of adaptation and losses and damages. Because why should developing countries that didn't contribute to this mess have to do the cleanup on their own expense? And yet we have hurricanes slamming the Caribbean islands. And then when they do, the United States says, oh, that's so sad, we'll send you $5 million. Or Pakistan, which had 1/3 of the country under floods and thousands of lives lost and tens of billions of dollars of damages, the United States, I think, gave $20 million afterwards in response. So this is the category called losses and damages, which is that when you're incurring costs from historical emissions, those who should pay for it are those who made the historical emissions. Somebody's got to tell the United States, you know, you did something like 20 to 25% of this whole mess. So you have to do something about it. But, you know, people don't like to talk about the US government like that, so they leave it to me. But my voice isn't strong enough to do this. We need the world to say, come on, we need fairness, justice, a losses and damages financing system, and then we could actually have both justice and the funding for adaptation and for recovering from these terrible emergencies which are hitting all the time. But my main recommendation in general is the following. The world financial system is really a funny thing. We have $25 trillion of saving, and in the rich countries, the borrowing costs are 3%, even till today. But try borrowing at 3% in Argentina or in any other developing country. You can't even come within hundreds of basis points of that. So the system is intrinsically unfair, and it needs to be fixed. And we need to understand that this is a market failure of a profound sort. And it's quite interesting, by the way. You know, the typical answer is, well, developing countries are risky, they default, and so forth. But if you actually look at sovereign debts, as you know well, Carmen Reinhardt has recently done this, for example, look at all the bonds since the Napoleonic Wars. The rate of return paid, actually paid, not just contracted, but paid by developing countries is several hundred basis points higher than that paid by the rich countries. And so the developing countries have gotten a bum deal for 2 centuries on this. And we need to fix that and understand that it is actually a failure. Ricardo Hausmann was right when he called it original sin or borrowing in someone else's currency. Once you get into that trap, and no country knows this better than Argentina, it's almost impossible to get out of this trap. But if we think about it now with the knowledge that we have, we should be reforming the international monetary and financial system again now. The Bretton Woods system has run its course, and it's time for a new international monetary and financial system. And now to incorporate China into this system, to incorporate a multipolar world, to incorporate digital central bank currencies, mind you, to bridge the financing gap by providing massive amounts of official financing through development banking institutions. There's a lot of wonderful things we could do, and that's why I think the G20 needs to be pushed to be the place to think big now. That, you know, we're not in 1944 now, we're not in 1946 now, we're not in 1971 now. In 2022, we need a new set of monetary and financial arrangements.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Just to continue the discussion we're having, I was wondering if you talked before about the worldwide stagflation, that it's worldwide spread nowadays, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on two issues. First, if you think there is a risk that the world could enter a sort of a chronic inflation, that the one Argentina has had for many years now, and is quite familiar with us. And second, if you think that that's not the case, and that the policies are the policies that are now being carried out are sufficient. So what I would like to ask you in that regard is, how could these remedies compare to the old remedies that were put into place in the 70s when there was the last stagflation? Because what I think, or what I think this time is different from that experience, is the massive monetary stimulus that took place in the last 10 years or so, and especially during the pandemic. So what is different now is the massive expansion of the central bank balance sheets, and I believe that there will be some kind of new solutions that we will have to come up in order to deal with this particular stagflation that we are now facing.
So these are great questions, of course. First of all, without question, many individual countries of non-key currency countries will be in a situation like Argentina's in, which is that the domestic currency suffers a high inflation. Turkey has a very high inflation rate, of course. I think several other developing countries will. The typical cause of that, of course, is chronic fiscal distress that leads to monetary fragility, a low monetary base, a high substitution between the domestic currency and international currencies, typically the dollar, and therefore a significant fragility of both the fisc and the monetary system. And we can absolutely be sure that several individual smaller countries will face this. Will larger countries face this? It's possible. There are many large economies that are in quite significant economic crisis right now, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and others. And what happens to them depends a lot on both the internal and the international dimensions of this. I guess the question is, could it happen in the US and Europe the same way in key currency countries? I think that the likelihood of super high inflation in those countries is not large, because these are countries without much currency substitution. They don't have monetary fragility in the same way. What's possible, by the way, is a prolonged economic crisis, but I doubt a prolonged super high inflation. It could be high inflation at the level of 5 to 15% on a chronic basis. That would be absolutely possible. Like the late 70s and early 1980s, a lot will depend on specific events, on how these supply shocks work their way out or fail to work their way out. But getting to a really high inflation generally requires a high degree of monetary substitution. The money has to go somewhere. And in countries that don't have currency substitution because they're key currencies effectively, and because those institutions didn't develop through chronic crises, it takes a long time and a big mess for that to actually happen. Once you have it, then it's very hard to get out of, as Argentina knows well, because you're constantly battling financial fragility. So in Argentina, a crisis that would hardly be noticed anywhere else becomes a cataclysm in Argentina fairly routinely. And that is because of how fragile the circumstances are, with a very high degree of money substitution, low monetary base, and the smartest macroeconomists among the taxi drivers and on the streets and in the shops that you'd find anywhere in the world, completely ready to make their currency moves in a way that wouldn't even be known in the United States for years to come. But I think the US and Europe could succumb to a serious social crisis, economic crisis, and so forth. God help us if it's the case, but that is absolutely possible. And because of the geopolitical tensions, I'm hoping that China will recover well. When the United States at one point really went after Japan in the early 1990s as well. Japan's slowdown in the 1990s was a little bit of US retribution also. It wasn't just an act of nature. It was, how dare you think you're number one? The US put on market controls. The US insisted on an overvalued yen, many other things, and basically said, we don't let you export to our market anymore. And so I hope that really hope China doesn't succumb to this kind of US pressures, but it's actually the hope, I think, of some of the US policy that that's exactly what could transpire. So I don't want to be completely bleak and pessimistic. I'm in a somewhat pessimistic mode right now because of the war and because of the rhetoric and because of the tensions, but we're not doomed to a prolonged economic crisis. It really comes back to how we handle this situation. It really does come back to the question of diplomacy.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your amazing presentation. Really, it helps a lot to analyze and try to understand the challenges time that we are facing. We hope to see you in person next time, and so thank you very much again.
Great to be with you, and let's be together in Buenos Aires sometime soon.
We hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.